Well, good afternoon. Thank you guys for joining us today. And those of you that are going back to listen to the recording, thanks for tuning in for the third of our gift planning boot camp series. Today, we're going to talk about endowments. So hopefully you came to the right place to learn a little bit about endowments. So just to start out, endowments are, that word endowment is largely a buzzword. And we in the philanthropic field, we like to sound sophisticated and name things and title things. And endowment's kind of one of those words that can mean different things to different people and different groups. So I have a definition on the screen of what is an endowment. And this specific definition says that it's a donation of money or property to a nonprofit organization which uses the resulting investment income. We're going to talk more about investment income for a specific purpose. An endowment can also refer to the total of a nonprofit's investable assets. And quite frankly, the word endowment can be different things to different people. But largely, if it's a pool of money that you draw off of for some type of ministry, mission, charitable activity, it can be called an endowment. Investment income is something that becomes very important because traditionally, if we were having this conversation in the 40s, 50s, or 60s, and we said investment income, to people then, and some people today, you're just talking about the interest the account earns, the dividends that the account earns, and it's really what would be taxable income to an individual. That's what they think of as income. With revised statutory guidance and laws in most states, investment income can now encompass some of the capital gain as well to a portfolio. Again, we'll touch on that a little more in the presentation. So key takeaways around endowments, what they are. Most endowments are designed to keep the principal amount intact while using that investment income, so there's that word again, for charitable efforts. Most endowments have rules that you can't spend the corpus or the principal amount, the original amount that was donated to fund the endowment. But again, there are some that allow use of all those things. Endowments tend to be organized in a legal structure often, such as a trust, a private foundation, or public charity. A fund with a charity meets this definition. A fund with a church, a fund with a foundation like MMFA can meet the definition of an endowment as well. Educational institutions, cultural institutions, service-related organizations, think of your large charities and religious charities, typically administer endowments. We certainly do at Moravian Ministries Foundations. We also help with endowments that churches themselves administer and deal with. The first endowment for those historians listening in was actually created by Marcus Aurelius back in 176 AD, and it was to fund schools of philosophy in Athens. The oldest endowments that I'm aware of that are still in existence were actually done by King Henry VIII and his family. So the off with her head Henry VIII, who liked to get rid of his marriage partners that he didn't like or whatever, has a bad reputation certainly for the way he handled married life and ruled in general, but he did some good things for philanthropy. And it was actually started by his grandmother. His grandmother, the Countess of Richmond, established endowed chairs for divinity at two schools, Oxford and Cambridge, and those endowment funded positions still exist at those organizations. And Henry VIII himself funded a variety of disciplines at both of those schools through endowments that are still active today. When the word endowment comes out in the United States, generally people think of Harvard, and there's good reason for that. Harvard is probably the largest endowment, but it's definitely the largest university endowment at just over 40 billion. 40 billion number was in 2019. So certainly they saw a drop in that last year with the COVID-19 pandemic and economic meltdown that happened. They have a year end of June 30th, so that impacted last year's numbers. Although when they report on this year, I'm expecting that to be back above the $40 billion mark. If you're interested, the second largest university endowment is actually the University of Texas. So it's not all the big Ivy League schools, as we usually think of with terms endowments. The different types of endowments, and there's 4 types listed on the screen here. You have unrestricted term endowments, quasi endowments, and restricted endowments. So what's the difference between all of those? So an unrestricted endowment is kind of like unrestricted tithes and offerings to your church. They can be spent, invested, distributed, really at the discernment of the organization receiving the gift. So really unrestricted endowments are just that. They can fully be used for the purposes of the organization. A term endowment exists for a term of time. It can also have rules around when the principal can be spent, and maybe it can't be spent or used till after 20 years of existence or something like that. Those are term endowments. We also encounter endowments that will only exist for 10 years or 5 years, and they must be fully spent during that time. Those are still term endowments. So not all endowments are perpetual or lasting forever. Some do actually expire, and those are the term endowments. Quasi-endowments are funds that are usually created for a specific purpose. And often with quasi-endowments, those are created by the institutions themselves for specific purposes of the organization. Maybe it's restricted funds or kind of designated funds. We call some funds here at MMFA field of interest funds. Those are a type of quasi-endowment. And often they're created by the organization using unrestricted endowment money to then kind of section that off for specific purposes. Restricted endowments, that's the exact opposite of unrestricted. It does have rules around it. The principal usually has to be held in perpetuity forever, and the assets are expended either per the donor's guidance, per the board's guidance, or for church specifications, etc. If you have a board restricted endowment, many of you may encounter where you have to actually include that in your calculation for your provincial share. And that's because the board has the ability to guide those restrictions or remove those restrictions. If you have a endowment restricted by your entire church body, church council, then that doesn't necessarily get counted in provincial share. Because certainly that's a more governed restriction, requires more action to change it. So there are some challenges even within the church, depending on what type of endowment you have and how that's counted, how that gets calculated into the various business of the church and ministries therein that are funded from these endowments as well. The terms of an endowment, it's important to know, cannot be violated without court or state law approval to do so. So what happens when you have an endowment that can't fulfill its original purpose? Say you have an endowment that was left specifically for choir robes and to always have the choir, covered in ornate robes or something for services, special concerts, etc. Well, what happens when your choir doesn't wear robes anymore? You would have to have the terms of that endowment changed or modified. State law does give some provision for terminating endowments that can't be fulfilled anymore. In North Carolina, that is usually under $100,000 in value, and you still have to get the Attorney General to approve it. And it's not an easy approval. They do scrutinize those pretty closely. We've helped some of our agencies and churches deal with these restrictions. The other thing is, organizations may not want a separate endowment unless it's a larger amount of funding. They may have rules themselves what governs endowments. So again, you go to state law for that stuff. If state law can't help you, then you have to go to court, and sometimes under the law, you have to go to court. There's also a doctrine of cypre. Cypre is Latin. It means as close to. So when you have a purpose that can't be fulfilled, what happens, the court will try to find what purpose or mission of the organization is as close to that original donor intent. So that's called the doctrine of cypre. But again, that's usually applied by the court. But again, you have to go to state law for that. And the laws on this stuff are very different between the states. So endowment requirements, when you manage an endowment, we always advise our churches of this. You have to manage competing interests, and sometimes that's challenging. And what I mean by competing interest, it's you want to use the asset for being the hands and feet of Jesus, the mission or purpose of the endowment. You want that fulfilling that philanthropic, that charitable or gospel-driven message and purpose. The competing interest is you're also going to have people on the board that want to ensure that that endowment makes money, doesn't lose money. So how do you get high enough investment return while also having enough money to spend for the purpose? That's often competing arguments. And we're in a challenging investment cycle right now, or market cycle, to do that, just because with interest rates being at or near zero, you're not going to earn over time, from a projection standpoint, that investment return that's required to do both of those. So you kind of have to set expectations accordingly, and that gets into the second bullet point, with setting clear expectations. What are your goals for your fund? What are the goals for the endowment? What do you want to happen? How much money do you want to spend, either on a percentage or amount every year? And then you kind of work toward that with your investment targets, even the individual investments that you're going to hold or allocate. You build an asset allocation mix. So that's your mix of investments around that. Select managers, manage your risk, and control cost, while defining responsibilities of everybody, your endowment board, whether that be the board of your church or a separate group. You want to do that so you meet expectations accordingly. It's important to mention here that there's actually regulations that come into play with endowments, and a relatively new one. The Congress, when they passed the Tax Cut and Job Acts back in late 2017, and then there was the Bipartisan Budget Act that followed in 2018, actually substantiated a tax for large university endowments. And there was a concern within Congress and the legislature that these huge endowments like Harvard and others, they weren't ever spending enough of their money to assist with their mission. And you give money to the students attending Harvard. So they put a tax on these endowments. It's 1.4% of investment income. And it actually applies to 35 private colleges and universities. They have to have at least 500 students, and the math has to work out to be net assets of at least $500,000 per student. So that tells you how large some of these endowments are. And they looked at that equation and said, wait a minute, you've got over $500,000 per attendee of your organization. You need to be spending more in terms of charitable grants. So periodically, we do see regulations come into play with endowments, and you need to be familiar with those. And I think that's one of the values we add here at MMFA, is being able to help churches and organizations that don't do this every day get through some of these regulations, requirements, and set expectations and goals with your individual endowments as well. Also in the regulation department, there's something called UPMIFA, which is a mouthful to say, but every state, with the exception of Pennsylvania, has some form, fashion of UPMIFA. It's Uniform Prudent Management of Institutional Funds Act. Listed on the slide here really tells you what UPMIFA does. It is specific. There are differences in some of the states with their adoption of this uniform law. But again, all states have some fashion of UPMIFA. Pennsylvania doesn't call theirs UPMIFA, but their state law is very similar to the UPMIFA background. So again, value your foundation adds to this conversation. As we are familiar with this, we can help make sure your guidance is being followed and you're being compliant with UPMIFA. It does apply to church funds. It applies to any institutional fund. It helps define what that net investment income is. Again, paying out part of the gain. What was happening under the old regime, where you just paid net income, interest, and dividends every year, is, the investment corpus was growing and growing and growing, yet the payout, as interest rates came down, really started to be less and less. So this really picked up steam in the 90s and early 2000s with this universal law saying, hey, we got to get part of that gain paid out as well, because the real purpose of these funds is to do the charitable work, not just create an investment empire. And MIFA aimed to try to deal with that, with the restrictions. There are other laws at the state level that help define what's income, what's principal in your portfolio. All the states have a Uniform Principal and Income Act. That UPIA is the acronym for that. Pennsylvania, again, has something called Act 141, which is very similar. And that helps drive what you can do from a spending rate, which we're going to talk about on this slide, and establish that payout rate for your endowment versus just the net income. So this slide mentions the different types of spending policies. Income, that's the old school one. It's just interest and dividends, or your income generated from your investments. A fixed spending rate is the one we favor here at MMFA. That's a percentage based on a value taken at a certain point in time. So the end of December is usually, they think of the end of the year, your 4 or 5% of whatever your endowment's balance is, that's your charitable spend for the next year. We do that on the endowments we manage here, and also encourage churches to develop some sort of policy around that. You can do smoothing or averaging. That's a variation of the fixed rate, except it's over multiple periods of time. People like to take the quarterly values over 3 years or 5 years, and they average those together, multiplied by the fixed rate. That just gets more specific, and it helps through up markets and down markets kind of smooth that payout so it doesn't vary greatly year to year. Inflation based, you look at CPI. This would not be a good one to look at right now in the market environment, because you've got CPI close to 5%, which is certainly a high point in recent years. You have the hybrid. This is sometimes also called the Yale-Stanford rule, used by those universities. It combines two spending policies and basically takes an average of those policies and compares those together for your spending rates. So spending rates can be very easy. They can also get very complicated. And again, your foundation's here to help set those spending rates. Again, factors to consider when you set a spending rate. You've got to look at economic conditions, what's going on in the world around you. Are there extreme pressures, expectations for something to go in the opposite direction of what's currently happening? Nobody could have foreseen how the pandemic, COVID-19, would affect the market when economies essentially stopped for a few months. And nobody could have seen how quickly that comes back. Those are things that have to be considered. Inflation, deflation. We're seeing inflation in our economy currently. That has to be considered. Is it going to stay at, CPI at 5%, or is it going to go down? Certainly, a lot of the leading indicators say that it's not going to stay high. It will, come down over the next several months. Tax consequences. I mentioned Congress taxing large university endowments. Are there other things that could change how endowment funds are viewed and treated by the regulatory authorities? What's the role of your investments? Is your investment mix appropriate to get the target return you're expecting over time? You've got to look at that. Expected total return, what are you considering? Income, capital gains? Are you looking at all that in your portfolio? Or are you staying totally locked in and bound to income? Are there other resources that exist for your church? So if you have to lower your spending rate, are there other resources or other levels of generosity at some level that can come in and help your church meet the ministry goal that you have? The need to preserve capital and make distribution, that's those competing interests. Are you open and talking about that? What's the church's goals? And do you have any special relationships to your assets or your mission? It may not always be, a fully diversified portfolio. Some endowments have assets that were contributed that can't be sold. And did those assets have a special relationship with that donor? You need to think through, before you would accept donations like that, you need to think through and make sure that's the right answer for your specific endowment, or is it going to get you in trouble down the road? Usually it's best to not have restrictions on specific assets or not be forced to hold them over a period of time. This slide has some sample endowments with churches that MMFA has actually helped set out a process, develop different endowment funds when the church is creating funds for people to give to. This is also part of our gift planning service and larger stewardship service that Laura Watson leads for us. But these are just examples of funds. These funds may have different names. They may have different missions for your church, but these are some that we see used a lot. A lot of churches have a music fund, and that's used for, acquisition of music, maybe instruments in some cases, materials, to hold community concerts or church concerts. That would be kind of the use of music funds. Mission and evangelism, that kind of supports the local efforts to spread the good news, to reach the unchurched or deliver hope to those in need. So kind of your hands and feet of Jesus. That's the fund that does a lot of that. Camp and scholarship fund, this is literally what that is. It's scholarships for kids to go to camp. It could be scholarships for leaders to go and spend a week at camp. If there's a cost for them to have to do that. It could be also higher ed scholarships, maybe for college students, or it could be specific for students or older, younger, et cetera, that are thinking about entering the ministry. Maybe they're going for a MDiv degree at the seminary or some other ministry source. It could be funds for that as well. Building fund, that could be both maintenance and support of your existing property. It could also be for new construction, if you're thinking about that. A cemetery fund, what we see often with churches is they already have enough money in the cemetery fund. So in some cases with endowments, it's not educating people what to give to, it's educating people what not to give to. You have to be careful there, be clear with your goals, and make sure funds are clearly communicated to your congregation or group of supporters. You want to make sure, hey, this is our church's mission. These are the goals and different endowments for our church, and you want to encourage donations to those to support the church into the future. Again, MMFA helps with this. We help churches develop what the ministry's goals, purposes are that are important to them from kind of a strategic planning standpoint, and then we also help them come up with funds to help with these endowments and encourage donors to give to these endowments in the future. We have individual endowments here at the foundation. We call them perpetual funds often. Like mentioned earlier, not all of them are perpetual. Not all of them last forever, but that's kind of what we call them. And again, endowment's a buzzword. Often we use perpetual funds or funds, but we can help if you're an individual and you want to make a plan to support several ministries that are important to you. Then we're here to help you with that. You don't always have to do that through your local church or through your favorite agency. And it's especially important if you're supporting multiple groups or agencies to maybe think about doing an individual fund or endowment for those purposes. With that, are there any questions about endowments? Kind of plowed through that pretty quickly. No questions. Vince, Zach, Laura, you guys still awake? All right, no questions. Listed on the slide is our fourth and final gift planning boot camp, which is next week, where we're going to talk about retirement planning and charity. So in some cases, we'll be going back to talk about split interest gifts that we've covered in a different session because they are excellent in terms of retirement planning. Involving charity, but we'll also be talking about the qualified charitable distribution from IRAs or individual retirement accounts and what the rules are around that. That's a great way for folks that are north of that 70 and a half age to make distributions without having to recognize the income that comes with those. So we'll talk about that in next week's session. Thank you three for hanging with me this afternoon, sticking with the definition of endowments. And I hope you guys that are going back to listen to this and enjoy this session and can bring some new definition to these conversations in your church. MMFA is your partner. We stand ready to help with that. So please use us as a resource as well. Reach out and have a conversation with Laura or myself. We're happy to help in any way we can. You guys enjoy the rest of your day.